So today we're looking at GL account configuration and exporting from FinPower Connect and the various formats available for importing into external accounting software, either to a file or via an API. The accounting interface add-on is a requirement for these functions to be available in FinPower Connect, with the exception of the Empower integration. However, it's important to note that Empower is no longer in development. The Entities add-on may also be required depending on the needs of the finance company. First, as usual, for those of us with limited accounting experience, we'll go through a brief overview of the area we're covering today and then follow on to the FinPower Connect configuration and functionality available. In its most basic sense, the accounting describes the process of tracking an individual or company's monetary transactions. Accountants record and analyse these transactions to generate an overall picture of their employers' their company's financial health. These days, their lives are made much easier by the many accounting softwares that are available, and each finance company that uses FinPower Connect will have one. Naturally, a finance company will want to record the relevant financial transactions pertaining to their lending or investment portfolios and associated charges and interest against the general ledger accounts they have set up as part of their full chart of accounts. This is where the GL account and export functions built into FinPower Connect come in. Built into the functionality is also things like accounting periods, transaction stop dates, and the ability to set up different files or exports relating to different entities to make things nice and easy from an accounting perspective. And in a multi-entity database, keeping these things separate if that's how the finance company chooses to operate. Some of the more common terms we'll be using today in relation to options within FinPower Connect include general ledger. So the term general ledger itself is a set of numbered accounts in a business uses to keep track of its financial transactions and to prepare financial reports. It summarises all the revenue and expenses of the business, plus the debts owed and assets owned. Each account is a unique record summarising a specific type of asset, liability, equity, revenue, or expense. Assets are the value of things that a business owns or part owns, e.g. inventory. Liabilities is the amount of what the business owes, e.g. bank loans. Equity, also known as capital, is funds introduced into the business and drawings by the owners. Revenue, aka income, money coming into the business through sales, interest, or dividends. And expenses, which is money paid out to keep the business running, e.g. rent or credit and interest to investors. Another term is chart of accounts, which is the list of all the accounts that make up the general ledger. It's kind of like a map that helps you categorise your transactions correctly and group similar accounts together for reporting. Each account must belong to one of the 5 types mentioned prior of asset, liability, equity, revenue, or expense, but a business may have many GL accounts of each of the categories for reporting purposes at a finer detail. Each of these accounts typically has a name, brief description, and a general ledger code to help record the transactions against the right categories and specific GL accounts. In theory, a good chart of accounts gives the business an overview of every area that spends or makes money. Bank transactions. These are transactions that directly impact the bank account. So, for example, anytime a transaction that is generated from FinPower Connect, where money will be changing hands from the company to the client or vice versa. These are separate to the journal entries that help keep track of the flow of the funds between the different categories within the general ledger, and often the difference can cause a bit of confusion to those not so accounting savvy, myself included. FinPower Connect will record any transactions that impact the bank according to the configuration. So we'll go through this, which we'll go through this session. And once reported in the accounting software, it is available to be reconciled against the company's bank statements. Bank reconciliation. There can be times where the finance company's financial records might not be the same as their bank's, so it's common for the bank reconciliation to take place as a standard bookkeeping or accounting practice. Bank reconciliation involves comparing these records and identifying any differences between the two. And this is really important for keeping track of the business's money. There are a few reasons the balance on the business accounting records might not be the same as the bank's, including things like changes to bank accounts at the end of the month. This can happen when you withdraw or deposit money just before the bank sends a statement. Those changes to the account might not show up until the following month's statement. The bank deducts loan payments. The bank can deduct money for any business loans before it's necessarily entered into their accounting software. Uncleared funds or transactions in transit that have been recorded in the accounting software but not yet formally processed through the bank. That also includes records from FinPower Connect of direct debits that have been processed but not actually processed in the real world as yet. And fourth, fraud or human error, which is important to detect as early as possible so that it can be addressed accordingly. Journal entries are a record of a business transaction in a company's books. A transaction might, for example, affect how much cash the business has, which is revenue or expense, how much money it owes, a liability, what it owes, assets, and the value of the business itself, equity, and how tax is treated. Each account that is affected needs to receive its own journal entry. We have an excellent page in our help called GL Journals and Transactions, which illustrates some example transactions common to finance companies and the resulting entries FinPower Connect generates, like the example here of interest, where it would debit the loan control GL account and credit the interest earned. Or also the payment and withdrawal examples, where they debit the bank and credit the loan control account. The link for this page here will be in the description on YouTube. There's some really important information at the bottom of this page on how the bank's suspense transactions work as well. It's not, unfortunately, in my image here, but it says if you export the general ledger and subsequently delete the suspense transaction within FinPower Connect, there is no corresponding transaction that is exported. You will need to manually update the accounting software to reflect this change. That's a really good thing to be aware of. And if you match the suspense transaction to an account before exporting the general ledger, it will be like it never went into suspense, and the resulting transactions will look like a normal payment to an account. Accounting period. An accounting period is any time frame used for financial reporting. Transactions that fall within a given date range form part of the statements or reports for that accounting period. An accounting period defines the length of time covered by a financial statement or operation. Examples of commonly used accounting periods include fiscal years, calendar years, and 3-month calendar quarters. Some organisations also use monthly periods. Dates can be configured in FinPower Connect accordingly to set the accounting period used to match the business's standard accounting period. Using accounting periods in FinPower is not mandatory, so only needs to be configured if the business wants to utilise the functionality the setting provides. In the context of FinPower Connect, this means that an additional wizard becomes available called the Close Accounting Period wizard. This wizard allows all transactions dated on or before the accounting period to date to be tagged to an accounting period code, which can then be used for reporting purposes. Now, moving on to seeing the FinPower Connect parts of the puzzle, starting with the global settings. I'm sorry, I sized that a bit badly. Hopefully you can see it well enough, but it's just a guide anyway, so you can see where to go. So in global settings, under the GL and accounting page, you'll find the main export settings for this area and some other key settings. Again, to reiterate what was said earlier, the accounting module is required for any export type other than Empower, and global settings is where we can configure the following options. The first is whether to use GST, also known as Goods and Services Tax, or the related similar tax for the relevant database country, and to define an exemption code if applicable. This exemption code can be free typed into this field or added to the information list GST codes, and it can then be selected from the drop-down list by the user amending global settings. The information list is also used to define the relevant GST codes attached to elements as required. Second, whether or not to use the accounting periods we were just talking about. And third, whether or not to use the general ledger functionality at all. The Use New Interface option should also be ticked unless there is a good reason not to. The new General Ledger interface was introduced back in 2019 in version 3.1.11 when the Xero API was also introduced. This functionality is no longer in beta since version 3.2.0, and the old GL interface will be obsolete in upcoming versions. So definitely something to be aware of and to be using. Once the General Ledger option has been ticked for use, the export type can be defined. This is where we select the format required by the client's accounting software so that the transaction information can be imported at their end. As with most areas of Empower Connect, this area in global settings is dynamic, and the fields change what are available depending on what is required by the export type. For example, once you get to the point where you select the export type, the relevant fields become available for the default export settings specific to that export file type's requirements. And in the case of MYOB and Xero, like over here, the fields to define the credentials needed to utilize the API integrations. We don't have time to go through each format specifically, but as we've already covered earlier, all except MYOB and Empower Direct generate a file that the client imports into their accounting software. For these services, as we've covered in other sessions, there are smart tags available to assist with the file naming conventions for the GL export in order to ensure the file name is unique. For example, in this image here, we've used the smart tag to default the export to the to default the export folder to the database export folder here. So that folder that it's defaulting to is set under the Documents and Templates page in Global Settings or in User Preferences. The GL export ID and a date stamp to include the year, month, day, hours and seconds of the export itself. As mentioned before, we have two services available with integrated APIs, which are MYOB and Xero. There are separate full guides on how to set up these initially, but they both essentially need an API key and secret in order for the API to work. Both services have handy inbuilt functions to aid in configuration. For example, if we have a quick look at MYOB, clicking the Verify button for MYOB or Xero will produce an informative box that often includes additional information required for the configuration, like as previously mentioned, some global unique identifiers for things like company files, IDs, and contact information. The names of these do vary between the two services. I think Xero calls one of them a tenant, and here we've got a company file ID as an example, but that's usually not too tricky to work out what is required. MYOB also will provide a list of GL accounts for you, which is really handy. So this is what they already have loaded on the MYOB side of things. In this image here, you'll see a list of export types that are currently available. Some of these are a bit older and probably not so widely used and may also now be known as different names. For example, ACPAC Bank was bought by Sage a few years ago, as I understand it. This is now known as Sage 300. They do have several APIs available, however, Empower Connect simply creates an exported file for this type. And Solution 6 was brought out by MYOB, and I think Green Tree is also related to MYOB. but yeah, this illustrates clearly here what is available. There is also the option of custom and a universal format. So custom is a good one to use if they are using one not currently available, and a scripted solution is required. So before you're ready to be using the FinPower Connect General Ledger Export, you also need to do some further configuration in the following areas. One, you need to create the General Ledger accounts via admin, GL accounts, which we'll go through in more depth in a minute. Link the GL accounts created to the bank for the bank account to the bank account record and the suspense. Set the relevant GL accounts on each account type for control and clearing, and ensure each element has a relevant GL account linked, which we covered off in week 18 in the Elements and Transaction Types session. The GL account records in FinPower Connect, if configured correctly, will match the relevant accounts in the finance company's chart of accounts and their accounting software. And then, by completing the above steps, linking each GL accounts to the elements, bank account, etc., when a transaction is created using that element or impacting the bank account, the record is then picked up accordingly and flagged to be included in the GL export and recorded once imported into the accounting software. GL accounts in FinPower Connect. So the form itself, as mentioned, is maintained in their own admin library, and the form is very basic, as not a huge amount of detail is required for FinPower Connect purposes. In order to configure these for the finance company, one of the easiest ways is to ask for a copy of their chart of accounts from their accounting software, or in the case of MYOB, you can already see it. We do have the two API integrations that offer an import all function. However, it's important to note that if you do import them all via the API, you will get all of their GL accounts imported in, and many of them will be surplus to requirements as they're just not relevant to the transactions in FinPower Connect. However, it's a nice, easy way to just get them all in there without having to manually add them. Your best bet would be to remove any not required, though there's no major harm in leaving them there as long as they're not configured elsewhere in FinPower Connect for use incorrectly. Importing them via the API for MYOB or Xero also means they'll come through with their correct appropriate category or subtype, which is useful. This isn't a mandatory field in FinPower Connect, as long as the code matches, and it will import correctly into the accounting software and be categorized correctly for their reporting purposes. If they're a brand new company just starting out, there may be accounts that they need to create in both systems that they've not considered yet, like the loan control account as an example. But this is where knowing where GL accounts need to be linked in FinPower Connect can help, as you, the FinPower Connect expert, can ask the client which account needs to be linked for this purpose. If the GL accounts are not importable, then adding these manually is not hard, as I showed before. You simply add one, fill in the code, noting again that it needs to match with the code used in their accounting system. Give it a name, choose the type, and if applicable, add in the alternate ID. MYOB in particular uses the alternate account ID to match the GL accounts using global unique identifiers, which I believe comes through on the import or updates after the first GL export if added manually. So once created, these GL accounts get linked in various places, including the account type, as mentioned. Here is the famous control account and the loan clearing account, which needs to be added. It also gets linked on the bank account, as mentioned, which is just here. So this is the special GL account only for the bank, or bank accounts if there are multiple, and 1 for suspense. And on the elements themselves. So we did cover that in a previous session, but just to point it out, there is a GL account page here where they can each be set depending on the requirements of the client. It's really important to get the configuration in FinPack Connect right so that this doesn't cause the finance company or their accountants a headache down the track. Provided you have clear instructions from them on which GL accounts and codes they require and for what purpose, the FinPack Connect setup is pretty straightforward. It's also important to do some test runs in a test database before going live, particularly if you or the client are not familiar with the accounting software, and particularly if it's a custom integration or export format, so that you can be certain the transactions are going through the right way round. For example, the credits and debits don't need to be flipped. That might sound strange to say, but we have come across some custom setups before where the software being where the transactions are being imported to interprets the information differently, causing the need for us to flip them at our end, to flip the out-of-the-box FinPower function to switch the direction of the transactions between debit and credit. For the existing available formats, however, they should already be good to go, but again, testing is key, especially if the information given by the finance company initially turns out to be incorrect, as these things do tend to be easy to get a bit lost in translation, particularly if you're not dealing with the staff in charge of the accounting side of things when setting up a new database for a new FinPower Connect client, as an example. Another area for configuration is the entity overrides. So as mentioned, if they have a multi-entity database, there is a page on the entity form that appears aptly named General Ledger that allows the overriding of the API key and secret if required, but most importantly, the company file ID, or in Xero's case, tenant. This then allows the ability to export separate batches for each entity or company, making it nice and easy for the accountant. So performing the GL export. Once your configuration is complete and things like the account processes have been run, bank transactions exported, etc., and you're finally in a position to do a GL export, this wizard is really straightforward. It's found in the process menu under Export General Ledger. The first page simply gives the option of completing a new batch or re-exporting a previous batch, which will give you a list of anything prior. The second page here is where the GL export ID can be generated and changed if necessary, and the entity is selected if applicable. So if you're not licensed for entities, might not appear. This is also where the export options are selected, giving the choice of what is included in the batch and the dates. Selecting transfer bank transactions and entering a date will export any transactions that impact the bank account. Selecting transfer journal transactions will export any of the transactions generated that update non-bank GL accounts, i.e. any transactions linked to elements flagged as a journal, and any other internal GL accounts that represent subcategories for accounting purposes, like this example file. So this is an Empower export example for just journals only. So it shows entries for things like interest and fees. I think there's a default interest, things like that. Selecting the accounting ledger transactions will, as suggested, include any transaction set by accounting ledgers for required adjustments. We're having a whole session on that next week, so I won't go into that further now. And finally, selecting transfer bank suspense items, which will export any bank transactions that have been allocated to the suspense account. If no dates are entered here, all transactions that have not yet been exported up to and including today will be included in the batch. The date for the accounting ledgers is pre-populated and generally speaking shouldn't be changed unless absolutely necessary, and any notes can be included here if required. The third page defines the export type, which is defaulted from global settings. Here, if a file is being generated as opposed to an API, the file name can be adjusted here. So if we look at Empower as an option, as an example. I think I had a... Nope, okay. So if we also look at the API examples, you'll see different options are available, as this is another form that is dynamic, independent again on the export type being used. The additional options available here include the close to date, which is an important one to be aware of. The option will redate all non-bank transactions dated on or prior to the date set here. This is to prevent transactions being dated in an accounting period that has been closed off. Again, the options differ depending on the export type that is selected, and as we can see here, if we choose 0, an additional option becomes available, which is create manual journals with the status of draft. This then allows a user in 0 to review them before committing them. Looking at the ACPAC option. Oh, it's not here. All right, well, help said there was an option there for an account structure that can be entered. There's an example on help on how that works. And there's also a summary narrative field that may be available, which allows the entry of a summarized transaction narrative or notes. This field is limited to 100 characters. And it's important to note that not all export types will support as many as that, so an error may occur. The smart tag GL batch ID or export ID is available for this field and will substitute the ID of the batch exported into the narrative text field. This can be handy depending on the accounting software for identifying which batch a transaction belonged to if it wasn't already clear. And finally, the export button can be clicked and the export will then either generate a file or submit the batch via an API. We also have a few other related wizards. The accounting period close wizard, the close withholding tax period wizard, and the activate accounting ledgers wizard, in addition to things like the normal account processes, process direct debits, export bank transaction wizards, etc. They all come together to link the financial process throughout FinPack Connect. The latter we have covered in previous sessions, and the accounting ledgers wizard will be covered next week, so we'll just briefly touch on the other two. So the close accounting period wizard simply facilitates the formal closure within FinPack Connect for the accounting period. We discussed accounting periods at the beginning of the session. As you can see here, the process is fairly straightforward. You simply need to know the date range for the accounting period in question, and the to date will pre-populate based on the number of months in an accounting period set on the entity. It's important to note that closing an accounting period updates the account transactions that are dated on or before the accounting period's to date, which we mentioned earlier as well. Any notes can be entered and then it's a simple OK. And the close withholding tax period wizard. This wizard is much the same, except of course for the withholding tax. So the dates will default to the most recent open tax period, which is typically the previous calendar month. This can be amended if it is not the date range that's required. Like with the close accounting period, Wizard, a closing a tax period will also update account transactions that are dated on or before the withholding tax period to date. Once a tax period is closed, transactions can no longer be written to it. Instead, the transactions will be included in the next month's tax period. This means if backdating a transaction is attempted, an error will likely be produced, advising of the above. Finally, I just wanted to mention some typical customizations for automation. Larger companies typically opt for a custom script to automate the export processes at their desired frequency. Some companies, for example, may choose to export bank transactions daily, but leave the accounting ledgers to monthly. This example would require either a custom script with logic to determine dates and options for the exports, or two simpler scripts running with required parameters and using different Windows scheduled tasks, or instead using things like web services or cloud scheduler if licensed and available. So we've come to the end of our session for today, but as always, if there's any additional information you seek, don't hesitate to contact application support for user interface queries or code support in relation to code-specific questions, as there's many scripting events available throughout the many processes with the financial transactions that can be utilised for custom requirements.